In this lesson, we'll talk about posing the models that we create in Mudbox. So many times we'll be creating characters and we'll want to put them in some sort of pose, or we may just need to move part of the body out of the way while we do some sculpting. So down here next to the sculpt and paint tools, you'll see the pose tools. So we'll go ahead and click on that. You can see we have 4 tools here: the create joint, pose, weights, and move pivot. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on the create joint. I've just got the human body starting point model here. So if you want to go ahead and bring that in, go ahead and bring that in through create mesh. And so let's say we now want to start to create a pose for this character. Now we could do one joint at a time. You can see I've got this create joint tool selected. If I turn on one joint at a time, we can come in here and it'll automatically center the joint within the volume of the shape. Okay, so you can see you have placement set to interior. If you wanted to place it on the surface, you can do that, but normally we'll have it set to on the interior. So if I go ahead and click and then start to drag out, you're going to see 2 things. We're going to have a sort of green line across the model. Okay, that's kind of a row of faces that are going across there. Okay, that's the joint boundary ring. Now in this case, we're doing the arm, so we want to actually just encompass the arm. So rather than dragging down the length of the arm, we'll go ahead and make that ring so that it just encompasses the arm like this. Now that vector that's coming out, you can see I'm making it longer and shorter here. That is the weights vector. So if we want a very short transition, okay, we don't want a lot of points affected, we can make it very short. If we want to have a more of a gradual transition in the weights, we can pull that out a bit longer. So now we'll release that. And so now what we have is this joint existing in the center of the shoulder, and then these green areas are what's going to be posed. So now if I go to the pose tool, I can use, as it says, my left button to rotate, middle button to translate. So if I use my middle mouse, I can move everything that's green. So in this case, I can use it to shape the model. If I want to rotate it, I can just click on that and I can rotate it in screen space here. Okay, so I'm just clicking and dragging here. If I click on the actual joint itself, you can see I can rotate it based on an axis going through that joint. Okay, I can also scale. Okay, and I can hold down Shift to scale it uniformly. Okay, so I can make his arm bigger or smaller. Okay, so this can be used to pull pieces out of the way, to modify the shape of pieces. If you want them to have bigger arms, you know, you could add a joint and make those bigger. Okay, and so what we can also do is actually create hierarchies of joints. So if we want to have more than one joint, so we'll go back to create joint. Let's turn off this one joint at a time, and we'll start by placing a joint right here in the center. And we'll go ahead and just drag this down. All right, now we'll go ahead and turn on mirroring, so we can actually create joints on both sides at the same time. So we'll just set that to X, and then let's come down here to the kind of the hip, and we'll go ahead and set our boundary ring appropriately and then drag out our weights vector. And you can see that because the influence was inside the influence of this joint, it's actually parented those together. We'll come down to the knee and do the same thing. Okay, you can see that that's automatically parented those. We can do the same thing down here on the ankles. All right, let's go ahead and switch our view to perspective. You can see how those joints are actually in the center of our volume. There are ways of moving the joints if we need to move them to a different location. We can do that. We can also paint our weights manually if we want to. So we can actually take our pose and pose this up. Before we do this, we can actually save presets of our poses. So let's say we want to have a variety of poses. So we can go up to Windows, Poses, and you can see here that we actually have the ability to save new pose. So we'll call this our default, and we'll save that. We'll say OK. Now you can see here on our object list, we actually have our skeleton, okay, with our joints in there. So if we select the skeleton, you get the options for your pose as well. You can see we now have a default pose assigned. So let's go ahead and just use our pose tool to modify this. So we'll grab this leg, and you can see how you can very quickly kind of modify your model based on your joints. Maybe move this over a bit. Okay. maybe rotate it a little bit more. All right, so we get something like this. So now if we want to save a new pose, go to Save Pose, and we'll just call this Pose 1, and save that. Okay, so now we're doing our, let's say we're doing some sculpting on this. We want to sculpt it in this pose, we want to see it in this pose. That's fine. Now we want to actually switch poses. We can go ahead and say go to Pose Default. That'll pop it back to the default pose. So we can have a number of poses in here that we can jump to if we want to. Okay, if we want to change our pose, we can update it, or we can get rid of a pose. If we don't like it, we can rename it. Okay, so posing is a really powerful way here in Mudbox to not only create poses for your character to test out what the sculpt is going to look like if it's posed in a particular pose, to see what that looks like, also to create a good presentation for your models. If you're creating kind of a scene, you can pose up your models here in Mudbox. It's also good for modifying the size of limbs, let's say, or different parts of your model. You can modify and move those around using posing. And also, if you have trouble getting into certain areas in sculpting, you can also use it for that as well. All right, so make sure that you check out the pose tools. And just remember, you can place the joint, pull out the weights vector, and also take a look at the boundary ring. If you're working on a limb like this, make sure to modify that boundary ring so that it encompasses the right spot. Okay, so you're not always going to be pulling straight down the limb. You may have to pull out from that shape. Okay, so the next thing that we want to talk about is Mudbox integration. So Mudbox works really well with a number of applications that are going to allow you to create a really comprehensive pipeline for your 3D work. And so let's talk about some of the options that we have here in Mudbox for working with other applications in the next lesson.